Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Our lecture today will be about radiobiology. Okay, what is the radiobiology? It's a branch of science which studies the effect of radiation on living tissues. This effect may be physical or chemical or both. As you know, adult human consists of cells which about 10 multiplied by force 14. In a human body, the platelets is the smallest cell. Okay. Cells consist of nucleus and cytoplasm. Certain cells don't contain the nucleus. For example, the RBCs. Okay. The important thing in this sentence that the chromosome is presented in a nucleus, and also this chromosome contains the genes which have the DNA material, and the radiation will affect directly or indirectly on the DNA molecules. Interaction of the radiation with the cells. In definite explanations, there are two theories or two actions for radiation interaction with the cells. It may be direct action or indirect action. This diagram will illustrate the both action. In the direct action, as we see here, the photon of X-ray will affect directly on the sensitive volume in the cell, which is the molecules or atoms of the DNA. Okay, this is called the direct action or target theory. When the radiation directly affects on the molecule of sensitive volume, we call this action direct action or target theory, when the sensitive volume is a target here. The second one, or the second action, is indirect, when the radiation affects directly on the molecule rather than the target molecule, and this molecule under the action of radiation will suffer from analysis, and this leads to formation of free radical, which is maybe OH or H free radicals, and these free radicals then will affect on the sensitive volume of the gene material or the DNA. This is called indirect action of the radiation. Okay. Here we will talk about radiolysis of the water. In human tissue, the human tissue consists of nearly 85% of water. So, the X-ray energy will deposit mostly by the H2O molecules. Some proportion of this energy of radiation will opposed resolved by the other materials such as skin, bone, etc. Now we will explain the ionization process that affect on the H2O molecule. Firstly, there will be physical changes. Here we see the H2O. Because of the radiation, it will lose electron and become ions, positive ion, because it lost an electron. This electron will capture by other molecule of water, and then this molecule, because of capturing this electron, will be negative ion molecule. These molecules are unstable. Till here, the change, it's a physical change. When this molecule, which is unstable, undergo analysis to be in more stable status, it will analyze into H positive and OH positive because it H2O positive drastically. The second molecule, which captured electron, it's also unstable and will undergo analysis to be more stable matter into H negative and OH negative. These ions called free radicals, which will interact with the proteins and carbohydrates and hormones and also other sensitive materials in the human body, and lead to breaking down these molecules. There are what we call oxygen effect. That means when there is a high percent of oxygen inside the tissue, this high percent of oxygen will increase the effect of the free radicals. Okay. The degree of susceptibility to radiation from the living tissue depending on the degree of cellular differentiation and cellular reproduction. Now we will talking about the latent period. What is the latent period? It's the period of time represent the time gap between the exposure to radiation and the appearance of the clinical symptom. Also, it can be from hours to years, partially depending on the dose. That means more severe dose, smaller in the latent period. Like in acute exposure to radiation, as what happened in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when they received, people there received high dose of radiation, different type of radiation in a small period of time. Okay, the end result of exposure to radiation may be either reversible or irreversible, or it may be conditional or critical. What's the meaning of the reversible action of exposure to radiation? The reversibles, it's mean that the cell will return to the normal state after exposure to radiation. Okay. While the irreversible mean that there will be permanent change occur in the cells after exposure to radiation, and it will fail to return to its normal condition before exposure to radiation. The third one, it's a conditional, or what we called it critical. The critical stage means that there are so affected of living tissue that another similar and or small dose of radiation will prevent their returning to the normal condition. Okay. What will happen to the cells that will exposed to radiation? There are 4 probabilities. Number 1, the inhibition of the mitosis may be occur, or maybe there will be chromosomal aberrations, or the cell may undergo mutations. The final stage, the cell may die. Okay, this the 4th stage represent what is the result of exposure to radiation in relation to the cells. Okay, lymphocytes and the oocyte, also the spermatocytes, are killed by few hundred of rads, while the organ that have the rate of cell division is low required several thousands of rads to cause death for them. Now we will talk about the biological effect of radiation in another classification. There are several classifications for the biological effect of radiation. One of these classifications is, can this effect classify into somatic effects and genetics effect? The somatic effects happened when the exposed individual to radiation suffer from this biological effect, while the genetic effect, it's not happened in the exposed individual, but we can see it in future generation of the exposed individual. Okay, now we return to the somatic effects, which we can classify them into acute effect and chronic effect. The acute effect, these will be manifested within a few hours to few days of acute irradiations, and the severity of the effect will depend on the dose and the dose rate. The dose, I mean the amount of radiation. Dose rate, how many the people or patient exposed to radiation on the time stages. يعني هنا نحسب الجرعة على الزمن، راح يطلع لي معدل التعرض للإشعاع وليس الدوز، وليس الجرعة بحد ذاتها. هنا اثنين هنا يأثرون. Okay, now we are talking about the chronic effect. The chronic effects are mainly due to low level of radiation for long period or chronic irradiation. Okay, we have in terms اللي هو the lethal dose 50 to 30. This is the very important terms used with experiments of radiation on living tissues. What's the lethal dose mean? It's mean the whole body acute dose required to kill 30% of the exposed organism within 30 days after irradiation. Lethal dose 50 to 30 for the man is between 400 to 600 rem. This lethal dose will be higher in fish, which required 700 rem to die. I mean the death for 50% of population in 30 days. That's very important. For snail, this lethal dose will be 10,000, and for amoeba it's 200,000 rem. Okay, this diagram or this figure will show the dose in millisievert and its severity for human beings. It will be at high risk when it will be between 2000 millisievert to 10,000 millisievert, which will be fatal within days. Okay, about when the dose be at range of 5,000 millisievert would kill half of those exposed within 1 month, while when the dose be at 2,000 millisievert, acute radiation sickness will be seen on the patient who exposed to radiation. Okay, this is the summary for the high risk doses. The moderate risk will be between the 100 millisievert and 1000 millisievert, while the tolerated level of the dose is between 0.1 millisievert to 10 millisievert, which is represent the yearly limit for nuclear workers who working at the nuclear fields. While the 10 millisievert it represents the average dose per year from a full body scan. Okay, 9 millisievert it's the yearly dose for airline crews who work with airlines and airports. As we say in previous lecture, the passenger and the airline crews which always spend their time with the flying and at high level of atmosphere layers exposed more radiation from the background radiation, especially the cosmic radiation, and this percent represent the permeable limit، يعني الحد المسموح به انه يتعرضون الى العاملين بمجال الخطوط الجوية، طواقم الخطوط الجوية. The mammograph, single mammograph for the patient who came to the hospital for mammography, which is nowadays become very commonly to check if there are breast cancers. In this diagnosis radiographical procedure, the patient will exposed to 3 millisievert of radiation, and the average yearly background radiation dose in the UK it's about 2 millisievert, and the final example here represents the single chest X-ray in millisievert, which is 0.1. This diagram represents which the common organs will be affected by the eradication, which may be eyes, thyroid, lungs, stomachs, and reproductive organs, which is commonly affected, should be protected always. Skin, bone marrow. Okay. Now we will take apart and define some organs or some part of the body may be suffer from exposure to radiation. Okay. Here we will speak about the chronic radiation effect on this area of the body. Okay. We will start with the skin. Radiation burns, which may notice because of continuous radiation procedures on the skin, which may produce an erythema, and this erythema appear like a sunburns. Okay, these were operator hold the film in the patient mouth by himself, and for this reason we always advise the student not to hold the film for the patient by themselves, and depending on the patient himself to do that. Okay, the second effect seen when the chronic radiations effect on the hair, which cause loss of hair, alopecia. It can result because too often or too long exposure to Roentgen ray, which the same meaning for the X-ray. The loss of the hair is not permanent. That's mean it may be returned to the normal condition after we stop the radiation. And this can be classified under the reversible effect. There are other organs commonly affected by continuous exposure to X-ray or therapeutic ray with patients who undergo of cancer or suffer from cancer. Firstly, we were talking about oral mucosal membrane. We may see redness on the mucous membrane and inflammation. The pseudomembranes are formed because the breakdown of the mucous membrane. Secondary infection by the Candida albicans is a common complication with this manner. The mucous membrane heals rapidly once the irradiation is over. Otherwise, after a few months, if the irradiation continues, the mucous membrane will tend to become atrophic and relatively avascular. This picture shows what will happen to the mucous membrane with the continuous exposure to radiation. This is commonly seen with patients who suffer from cancer and received doses of radiation for treatment. Here it shows the grade of the soreness and ulceration which we may see with the patient undergo of cancer. The stage 1 grade 1 we see only erythema, and then the ulcer may found and the ulcer become worse. Finally it's look like this. Other area interested in dentistry who may undergo some changes because of exposure to radiation is a taste buds which undergo degenerative changes that at first, and then the loss of taste is very common. In relation to the salivary gland, there are many things may happen to them. Firstly, it may undergo of acute inflammation involving the serous acini of the gland. Second, a marked increase in the serum amylase could be found in the salivary gland who undergo from the continuous or chronic exposure to radiation. The gland then demonstrated a degeneration. The salivary gland have performed influence on the oral microflora and on dentition. Increase in Streptococcus mutans number and Lactobacillus and Candida. Also, we may see xerostomia because of the degeneration of the salivary gland that suffer from chronic exposure to radiation. And this changes seen or represent what will happen to the salivary gland under microscope. Okay. In relation to the teeth that affect with the chronic exposure to radiation, we can summarize them here and we can speak in details. Briefly, the growth is retarded if the exposure occurs during the development of the teeth. If the radiation precedes the calcification, the tooth may be destroyed. After calcification, if the irradiation is continuous, malformation can result. Also, the root development is retarded and the tooth may erupt prematurely. In details explanation, for the adult teeth, the resistance to the radiation effect. Okay. In relation to the developing teeth, here the retardation of the root development may happen. Also, dwarf teeth, failure to form one or more teeth, that may happen with the developing teeth. Tooth buds destruction, calcified teeth inhibit cellular differentiation, and this will lead to malformation, and the final result will be arrested general growth of these teeth. The pulp, due to exposure to chronic effect of radiation, there will be decrease in vascularity, and this will reduce the cellularity, and in the final result may be tooth prone to pulpitis. Okay. Eruption mechanism, what will happen to it due to chronic exposure to radiation? Radiation resistant irradiated teeth will alter root formation erupt, even if rootless. Okay, the severity of the damage depending on the dose dependent. Okay, depending on the dose and the dose rate. In relation to the bone, in the maxillofacial area, the mandible is the most susceptible to be irradiated frequently during the treatment of the cancer. The predominant change occurs in the marrow lacuna of the impact bone, and this will lead to decrease in the vascularity of the bone, and secondarily this will lead to decrease in the capacity of the bone to resist the infection, and the osteoradionecrosis is the most possible disease occur due to chronic exposure to radiation and infection of the bone. Here what would happen for the bone who undergo chronic exposure to radiation in details. As we say, the mandible is the most susceptible to this, and this may commonly seen with the patient who received radiation for the treating from the cancer in the oral region, definitely. This will lead to damage to the fine vasculature, and the result of this primary damage to the mature bone. If the irradiation continue, the normal bone marrow will be replaced by fatty marrow, and this will lead to fibrous connective tissue. Bone marrow become hypovascular and hypoxia due to decrease in the oxygen level, and this will lead to the hypocellular. Degree of mineralization will reduce. Brittleness is a result from the bone marrow. Endosteum become atrophic, which means lacks osteoblastic and osteoclastic activity. What is the osteoradionecrosis? Is the most common disease associated with the chronic exposure of the mandible to radiation, and it's percent between 2% to 22%. With the modern devices, modern X-ray equipment, we reduce this percent to less than 6% of all cases.